We're going to kick off this presentation with just a kind of a roundtable panel discussion. We've got Steve Easterby and Aaron Alexander and myself. We are the agronomists for Valent Biosciences. We each cover our own respective territories. We have Steve out on the West Coast, we have Aaron out on the East Coast, and then I cover the territories throughout the Midwest. With that, I'll kick it over to Steve. Steve and Aaron, what we're gonna talk about are the current conditions of the crops that are in their area, what type of environmental conditions they're seeing, what stresses or stressors their growers or customers are currently talking about, and sort of what practices they are utilizing to help combat those stresses. So with that, I'll kick it over to Steve.
Yeah, sure. I live in California and cover the basically west of the Rockies and crops and keeping an eye on those. And just like everywhere else in the country, we have had some very high heat, and 100 plus degrees is very normal for at least the Central Valley of California. But that usually comes in July, August, early September. So mid-June is a little early for this high heat. And crops are at some pivotal stages. You know, we grow a lot of nuts over here, and almonds and pistachios are actually nearing their later stages of nut fill. And in July, that hole split will occur where the almond hole actually splits open, and then harvest starts up in August. And so right now we're in a very pivotal stage. And we know that the biggest impact to the crops over here, whether it's the vine crops or the tree crops or vegetables, is that when it gets so hot, the stomata on the leaves of the plants, they close to prevent water loss. And that's okay for conserving water. But when the stomata close, that means the water can't be released through those stomates. And that's what is cooling the plant. Just like when you sweat, in a similar way, when we sweat, it creates cooling. Same thing with plants. It's like takes away their ability to sweat. So they're not that evaporative cooling effect by losing moisture through their stomates is gone because their stomates are shut. And then the heat builds up and then it kills that part of the leaf. And so we'll see some browning and crispy leaves when it gets this hot, and some leaf drop also, whether it's in vegetables or nut crops. And then also, you know, nutrients move with the water. And so right now with this latter stage of nut growth, we're trying to get as much potassium up in there. Potassium is huge for the latter stages of nut fill and tree crops. And that's that bulking stage. And if we can't get water moving through the trees, it's not carrying up potassium. So we're limiting the amount of bulking that we could be doing. And then for vine crops, right now, like in wine grapes, the berries are smaller and green, but there's a lot of cell division occurring. This is a major stage for cell division. And we know that calcium is a big deal for cell division, and same thing with potassium. Calcium is not going to move through that plant unless water is moving too. And if the stomates are closed, we're not getting calcium up there to get into those berries, which means we're not getting as many cells as we could, and that affects final berry size, which could affect yield. And so this is, could have a negative impact on crop yield in the end. Some things that growers might be doing around here for these crops. So everyone's irrigated in Western and specialty crops, so it's not a problem of having enough water, although sometimes, that can be an issue. But most of the time, there is enough water to put out there. But that's not going to help with getting the plant moving. If it's hot, they're going to shut down. So some growers will try to use some sort of biostimulant in a foliar application. If a pesticide application is already going out, they'll throw one in there. Seaweeds, organic matter extracts, and that sort of thing. That's kind of the main thing done, besides just cranking up the water and pumping it out there and keeping those pumps moving.
Sure. By you, Aaron?
Very similar to Steve in that, we're hot. daily temperatures getting into the mid to high 90s, with heat indexes into the low 100s on a daily basis. And like Steve said, this is a little earlier than usually anticipated. We always kind of get this heat event right around the weekend of July 4th, but it's been ongoing for a few weeks now, with this, I think, so far being the fourth hottest June on record for North Carolina, at least. Um, and then to join with that, we have had very spotty rains across the South. I know personally here at home, it's been close to 3 weeks without a rain event. And while we do have some irrigation across the South, I would say the majority of our acreage is dry land. Um, so not a whole lot we can do there. As you drive across the countryside, you're seeing a lot of curled up corn. What I call kind of silver belly beans. They're kind of turning over, showing the bottom side of that leaf looking a little gray, a little silver. So seeing a lot of that across the area. And the bad thing is, for the two major crops across the South, corn and soybeans, this is hitting right during, for a lot of the bean crop, we're starting to abandon some flowers. For corn crop, it's right in the middle of the tassel. And so I expect to see a lot of pollination issues. Once ear formation, everybody starts to look at their ears after they're made, we're going to start seeing a lot of blanks, is my main concern. And something I think that we're dealing with, that Steve probably doesn't have to over in the West, is we still have very high nighttime temperatures. I made sure to check the temperatures last night about midnight before I went to bed, and I think the temperature was 82 and heat index was still up around 85 at midnight last night.
Yeah,
So that plant, even at night, isn't really functioning at 100%. Is a big
no,
deal for us.
yeah, and corn makes a deal at night. So
No, not now.
yeah, yeah. Well, appreciate you guys chiming in on conditions in your guys' area. I'll save my talk. It's going to allude to some of the conditions that are going on in the Midwest, for specifically for corn. I'd say without further ado, I'll just jump right in. I just want to confirm that you guys are able to see my presentation. Everything is up
Yep,
and everything is going
looks good.
great. All right. Okay. So first, I just wanted to, thank everyone for joining today, and taking time out of your guys' busy schedules. I know throughout the Midwest, things have been delayed. A lot of jobs, a lot of activities. Some people just started planting or just stopped planting a few weeks ago. You guys are still side dressing right now. Some of y'all are still spraying your posts. Some parts of the Midwest, the lower parts of the Midwest, actually are tasseling. So we're uh, trying to uh, still get some fungicide applications out like that. So I know it's a very, very busy time, and I just wanted to thank you guys for taking some time out of your schedule and or out of your lunch hour to talk with me today. I did turn off my video feed. It's actually pretty fitting for the talk that we have today. Yesterday, my AC went out in my home, so it's pretty doggone hot, and it's not crazy like Aaron mentioned. It's only in the high 70s, but as folks from Midwest know, high 70s with you know, super 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 high humidity. It's pretty much uncomfortable as heck. So I'm presenting out of our local library, and the data speeds just can't handle me sharing my video feed and the presentation. So you guys will get to see my screen, but you won't necessarily get to see my beautiful face for the rest of the day. Moving forward, what I'm going to do is give you guys a brief introduction as to who we are at Valent Biosciences, and what biostimulants are. I'll talk about some key crop growth and development stages where stress and weather events can cause the most impact. Then I'll talk about some of the current weather conditions that we're currently seeing, and what we could potentially see, and then talk about what kind of tools we can utilize to help alleviate that stress. So, who we are. We're Valent Biosciences, and Valent Biosciences is a part of the Valent group of companies under Sumitomo Chemical. The companies that are primarily under the Valent umbrella are Valent USA, which you guys may have heard of and are more familiar with, and they typically deal with the more traditional crop protection products. And then there's us, who primarily focus on the biorationals and biostimulants. Together, we have just over 60 years of experience with these crop enhancement products, and we are really committed to helping our growers, our retailers, and our customers, and providing them with value-added products that can help maximize their ROI. Now, what are biostimulants? It's kind of a gray area at the moment. I would say that's primarily because the EU and the US aren't totally aligned. But in 2018, the US with the 2018 Farm Bill, the US has defined biostimulants as a substance that stimulates a natural process to enhance a nutrient uptake, nutrient use efficiency, tolerance to a biotic or an abiotic stress, and all of it is to ultimately increase yield or biomass, or as Steve was kind of alluding to out on the west with the specialty crops, to increase yield quality, right? And I'll say typically within production agriculture, and I'd say most especially with row crop agriculture, the implementation of biostimulants into the market needs to come from an economical place. And I would say for most growers, that means that these products really need to be a free ride product, or they need to coincide with an application or a practice that is already current standard within their current grower practices. And really, that kind of boils down into one of three scenarios: either planting, post-emergence, or a fungicide, right? I mean, every crop needs to be planted or sowed. So naturally, the first opportunity that we would get with a biological or a biostimulant would be at planting, with it either being on the seed as a seed treatment or as a product that's going out in furrow. Now, the other two methods are a foliar application, or most likely to be a foliar application. And really, that's the post-emergence herbicide that leads or lends itself to be more exposure for the biostimulant market. And that's primarily because over 95% of corn and soybean acreage is going to receive a post-emergence herbicide in some fashion, from V1 to V3 for soybeans, or V3 to V6 for corn. Now, the second foliar timing would be with the fungicide or insecticide. We're not necessarily promoting the use of prophylactic fungicide in the absence of disease pressure, but if the disease is present, or a grower decides that he's going to make that fungicide application because there is the presence of a biotic stress, there's more than likely other stressors like abiotic stresses that are in conjunction with that stress, and it's just another opportunity to get or to utilize a biostimulant. Now, I will say that there's a gaggle of biostimulants, biostimulant products out there. There's a lot of startups out there, and it really kind of lends itself to some confusion. But pretty much, even though there's a wide range of products, I would say that if we look at review articles or secondary literature, they pretty much boil them down into these main categories. And these categories are amino acids, or they're often reported as protein hydrolysates. We have humic and fulvic acids, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, or AMF. We have some marine extracts or seaweeds, and then we have enzymes like phosphatases, stuff like that. And I would say the majority of these products are really useful with abiotic stresses because they're at some level modulating some physiological response that is either priming or rescuing the plant for an abiotic stress. Now, I think to better understand where a biostimulant can help increase yield or mitigate a certain stress, it's important to first understand how yield is made and where the crop could be most sensitive to a stress, right? So if we look at this chart, this is just a standard corn crop growth and development chart from the University of Illinois. It goes from vegetative all the way to R6. We can break this development down into different stages, and those different stages all coincide with a different component or a different function of how the yield is made, right? And that's because yield can be broken down into an equation. So really, yield is a function of the number of plants that are on that acre, or more effectively, the number of ears that are produced on that acre. It's multiplied by the number of kernels on each ear, or kernels per plant, and then is multiplied by the average weight per kernel. Now, obviously, any stress that occurs vegetatively has the capacity to decrease our yield potential, and it decreases our yield potential by either reducing the number of rows on a certain ear. I know that's primarily handled by genetics, but when you get the G by E, the environment can play a role. So we can have a reduction in rows per ear, and then any stress into the later vegetative stages is going to ultimately affect how large that ear is going to be. Then we get into the VTR1 or R2, where we start to see pollination issues from a stress, kind of what Aaron was previously alluding to. And then any stress that occurs during the reproductive parts, whether that's a reduction in photosynthetic efficiency, a reduction in intensity or duration, is going to result in a couple of things. It's either going to be kernel abortion, or what it's going to do is ultimately result in lower kernel weights or reducing the overall yield potential. Now, I will say that widely known across the Midwest and in the U.S., right? Corn is the king. But just because corn is the king, it doesn't mean that it's not a prima donna, and it most definitely is a prima donna, especially when we start talking about those offensive type of hybrids. Those offensive hybrids are usually selected because they have top end yield. But just because they have top end yield, that means what that typically goes with is they're not very adapted to handle stress. That means it really can't have a bad day. So if we're going to use these racehorse hybrids, it really means that we need to help them get off to the races, and we need to get them off on the right foot. Now, starting off on the right foot really means starting off correctly back in the fall, right? Nothing in agriculture ever occurs in a vacuum, right? Everything is part of a cycle, and harvest actually plays a really important role. When it comes to setting up your combine to produce uniform sizing and uniform distribution, not only is that going to be extremely important for how your planter will perform, but an uneven distribution of residue can create spatial zones in the fields where some areas will be colder and wetter than others. And that's important because when we're trying to talk about getting a crop up and getting a crop up fast, what's really more important is getting a crop up uniformly. I know all growers out there really want that picket fence corn, right? With even emergence and perfect spacing. But some researchers, some extension researchers at Purdue have noted that for every extra inch and variability when we get with our plant spacing, we really only reduce our yield potential by about 2.5 bushels. Whereas some work out of the University of Minnesota has shown that for every plant that comes up one leaf behind, as seen by this photo here, it can reduce our yield potential by 20%. And a plant that comes up two leaf behind can have a yield potential reduction of up to 50%. So it's extremely important that we get our crop up in a uniform fashion, right? And I will say this this spring definitely was a gauntlet, and it definitely posed our challenges in trying to accomplish this goal, right? For the most part, April started off on the cooler side, and it kind of delayed planting a little bit. But then it transitioned to be a really, really warm spring. It was actually very conducive for temperature wise for getting our crops up and going. But I would say that I would say the temperatures weren't really our issue. Our issue was that it was wet, and boy, was it wet, right? I'd say talking with our customers and our growers across the Midwest, it seemed like during the month of May, every single week there was a serious rain event, a tornado, some hail, pretty much an event every single week that was preventing growers from getting their crops into the ground. And the ones that were able to get the crops in the ground, afterwards it just kept raining, right? When we look at these charts here, pretty much in either April or May, every single part of the Midwest got somewhere between 200 and 300% an increase in their average rainfall for that area. And I would say it's my guess, for the fields that are in your area, just from my own personal experience of driving around and looking at fields this earlier this June, that you guys have seen a lot of fields that sort of look like this one, right? Just a lot of flooded fields and a lot of ugly crops. Now, that's a problem, right? Because flooded fields can cause a seriously stressful environment for a whole range of reasons, right? We can have the the water clogging the pores and restricting oxygen from the soil. During that, we can also have through microbial respiration of them burning up the oxygen that is in the soil. And really, a couple of extension specialists will tell you that flooded fields that are truly flooded, corn crop, if it's cool, can probably last 3 to 4 days. But if it's warm and there's a lot of respiration out there, the crop can really only last 2 days if it's in the mid 70s. But really, I would say a main issue in looking at the fields and driving around the Midwest is that there's evidence of some serious nitrogen loss, right? And the nitrogen loss can happen from a few different ways. It can be leached. The nitrate can be leached out of the rooting zone, or what's most likely happening in these waterlogged soils is through denitrification, right? And the problem is when these soil temperatures get into the mid 70s, like it is, like when I showed you a couple slides back, we can really start to get some significant nitrogen loss every day that those soils are waterlogged through denitrification. Talking with some retailers and growers throughout the Midwest, I would say the average range that I've heard is that growers were going out and side dressing an additional 50 to 75 pounds of nitrogen due to this stressful event. And my really the best advice as an agronomist that I could give in this situation would be just to go out and scout the fields, right? We can take some soil samples, take some pre-side dress nitrate testing samples, and see what levels of nitrogen are out there still. What's remaining, and utilizing extension resources like the one on the right, and determining if a nitrogen application is necessary. And I would say, if a nitrogen application is necessary, then this would actually be another good opportunity to utilize a biostimulant. And it's actually a biostimulant that I previously haven't really discussed. And that would be our product called Transit Soil. And really, Transit Soil could be used, as fertilizer impregnation if you're going to be applying it top dressing with some urea, or it can be tank mixed within 28 or 32% UAN if you're going to be putting it in your side dress toolbars. Now, to further, talk about like what is that transit biostimulant? Well, what transit is a diverse mixture of compounds that comes from complex organic matter, and it includes some tannins, some lignins, and some condensed aromatics. It's our flagship biostimulant, and it's been shown in the literature to decrease abiotic stress, increase nutrient uptake, and pretty much increase overall plant health. Now, to me, what transit is, transit is primarily a regulator, right? Transit's ability to induce plants to either upregulate or downregulate certain plant functions, like downregulating ethylene synthesis and protein binding receptors, to upregulating nutrient uptake and lateral root growth or root elongation. And as you'll see in this next slide, it's a combination of these functions that provides the plant to drastically increase its nutrient uptake, use, and efficiency for really both the macro and the micronutrients. And I'll key in here on the nitrogen component, right? Over 20 of our internal studies have shown that we tend to get about a 10 to 20% increase in nitrogen use efficiency. And that's why I think it would be a perfect fit in these stressful conditions right now to add when side dressing your additional nitrogen. Now, I think to further ram this point home, we had a study looking at nitrogen use efficiency in 2021 up in Whitewater, Wisconsin. What we did is we had a 175-pound rate, a 200-pound rate, and a 225-pound nitrogen rate, both with and without the inclusion of transit soil. And really, at every single nitrogen rate, the addition of transit soil significantly increased yield. But that's not the main take-home point here. The main take-home point is that we really increased our nitrogen use efficiency. And that is apparent when we look at the 175-pound and the 200-pound nitrogen rates. When those rates were combined with transit, we were able to produce the same yield as the 225-pound rate without transit. So we're effectively doing more with less. All right. Okay. Now, I would say changing gears here a little bit. We just talked about what happens when there's too much water and how stressful that can be with the crops. I now want to shift gears here and talk about what happens when the water shuts off and we start to go into a drought, right? And we really need to first define what a drought is. And I'm sure if I could see you guys back home, you guys would all be rolling your eyes, right? You're like, we all know what a drought is, right? A drought is a period of persistent dry weather that is over an extended period of time. Right? But the problem is that's not the only type of drought out there, right? And that's not really, maybe like what Steve was alluding to, where the water shuts off out west and it never turns back on. But the drought that we're most likely to experience here in the Midwest is what's called a flash drought. And that really is more along the lines of a heat stress, right? We have high temperatures that cause increase in transpiration rates of our plants, which is causing a greater demand for our soil water supply. And then when you factor in evapotranspiration rates and adding wind into the mix, what it does is it just creates a really vicious positive feedback loop that can just spiral out of control and cause abiotic stress. Now, I would say looking at these figures, you can see by the one on the left that in early June, there really wasn't much of an impact in the Midwest when drought is concerned, right? And that's because we had all that water coming through May. We had water in the soil profile, and really our crops weren't up and going thus far. But if we look at the one on the right, which was taken a couple weeks ago, we see that now that our crops are up and going, our temperatures are starting to get very, very elevated. There are pockets of drought concern starting to emerge. And really, this can change very, very fast, right? So I would say the reason why this is important is sort of going back to what I mentioned before. These high yielding hybrids are prima donnas, and it doesn't handle heat stress very well at all. And heat stress will most likely reduce our overall yield potential. And that's because corn is sensitive to high temperatures that exceed 86 degrees. And that really has to do with a net photosynthetic rate. And right, or what I mean by that is photosynthesis minus respiration. That's where we get that net photosynthetic rate. Right. We all know that from rudimentary photosynthesis that we were taught in grade school, right? Plants produce sugars by splitting water and assimilating CO2, right? But plants also need to utilize those sugars through respiration to produce their own energy in the form of ATP so that they can carry out functions that are necessary for plant growth. Now, when temperatures get above 86 degrees, certain enzymes start to become inactivated, and we get lower rates of photosynthesis. Not to mention, when we talk about how Steve was kind of talking or alluding to earlier, plants will close their stomates in the attempt to conserve water. But the gas exchange of CO2 occurs from those stomates as well. So when plants close those stomates, it's like putting yourself on a diet, right? Anything that'll ultimately reduce the photosynthetic rate while not reducing our respiration rates will ultimately result in a lower net photosynthesis and a reduction in yield. Coincidentally, that's also why for the modified growing degree days, the floor is set at 50 because those enzymes aren't up to par and operating yet. And then at 86 is our ceiling, and that's because those enzymes become deactivated. Now, so similar to what Aaron was talking about earlier in this presentation, there are certain key growth stages that are more susceptible to heat stress. And the most certain one by far is at pollination. At pollination, you can see in this chart here on the right, anything from the late vegetative stages to that early blister stage that messes up our pollination will ultimately result in fewer kernels per area. And it doesn't matter how much photoassimilate we accumulate, we will eventually run out of places to put it, and we will ultimately receive a reduction in yield potential. So now that I've sort of outlined how heat stress can sort of affect the yield of the crop, I want to talk about what are some of the tools that a grower has or in their toolbox, or what they can utilize to help mitigate some of these stresses. And one of those tools would be utilizing arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, or AMF. Now, what AMF is it's basically a naturally occurring fungi that forms a symbiotic relationship with the crop and sort of acts like a secondary root system. And really what it is, it's like a miniature economy down there. In exchange for carbon assimilant from the plant, the AMF will provide greater access to nutrients like phosphorus and greater access to water. Now, due to certain modern farming practices like tillage or anhydrous ammonia use, these natural populations that exist in our soil can become depleted, and extension research throughout the Midwest has shown that crops can benefit from supplemental inoculation. Now, to further get into how AMF works, essentially root exudates can trigger the germination of these AMF propagules. From there, the hyphae that spawns from these propagules can penetrate into the root cortex tissues and colonize the plant and establish that symbiotic relationship. From there, the hyphae then proliferate and expand into the surrounding soil, thus effectively increasing the overall rooting area of the plant. And some literature will say that the absorption area can be increased up to 50-fold. Now, this symbiotic relationship can really lend itself to have many benefits to the plant. But I would say the main benefit is that effective increase in root mass. And that increase in root mass really sort of waterfalls into these other benefits like increased nutrient uptake and drought tolerance. And really, it's these two benefits that will, for our sake, be useful in tolerating these heat stresses or drought stresses for its ability to have the plant have an increase in nutrient and water use efficiency. Now, we at Valent Biosciences, we have our own formulation of AMF, and we call it Synvedo. Now, Synvedo comes in a few different formulations. We have the SC formulation, which is as an Enfuro product, and we also have the ST formulation, which is a seed treatment. But to really further demonstrate the ability that AMF has on helping plants survive or thrive in these drought conditions, I want you guys to look at this side by side here on the left. On the left of this side of this image, we have the untreated plants. And what we can see is that there's massive firing in these crops. And this crop is heavily stressed for both water and nitrogen. Whereas if we look on the right side of this image for the Synvedo SC treated plants, on the right side, we see that the canopy is much more deeper in color for leaf greenness. And we see that it is healthy and there's very minimal firing in the lower canopy. If I was a betting man, I would say that this would ultimately lead to greater nutrient assimilation and increased photosynthetic intensity, efficiency, and probably duration. And this will ultimately lead to an increase in overall graining. And that's exactly what we can kind of see here on the right side with this chart. The Synvedo SC treated plants significantly increase yield and actually increase yield by over 11% over the untreated in these drought conditions. Now, I will say there's a catch-22 to this, right? With Synvedo or with AMF, it's extremely important that we establish that symbiotic relationship early on, right? We can't jump in our DeLorean and go back in time now that we're in a droughtful situation. So it's something that really needs to be on the foreground of growers' minds who are thinking of how am I going to set my plants up for best success in the event that we run out of water or we get these high temperatures. And we really need to be thinking about utilizing this resource at planting. Now, while I will say AMF definitely does perform well on coarser soils or in these very stressful environments, it does perform well under normal conditions as well. So just because that stress doesn't come doesn't mean it's not still a useful practice, right? our internal field trials have shown that in the absence of stress, we still receive, on average, a 5 bushel per acre response and about a 75% win rate. And I would say really there's research coming out of extension land grant extensions that are illustrating that when we utilize AMF with a shot of nitrogen or 1034O in conjunction with this practice, the yield responses can really be much higher. Now, another tool that growers can utilize in the event of a heat stress or a drought stress would be that of the marine extracts or seaweed extracts. And seaweed extracts have been shown to induce the plant's ability to accumulate ABA or acetic acid. And ABA is one of the top 5 plant growth regulators. And what it does is it induces the plants to close the stomates, which is a pretty key function if we're going through a drought stress, right? We want to be able to conserve that water. That ties directly into why seaweed extracts or plants treated with seaweed extracts have reduced water loss and have the ability to recover after that water stress has subsided. Now, the other thing is, in the absence of that stress, it's also shown to have increased somatal conductance. So when the stress is over, we have higher somatal conductance, we have higher gas exchange rates, and we're able to kick it back into overdrive and sort of recover from the yield that we might have lost during those conditions. It has also been shown to activate certain genes that will increase root elongation and lateral root formation, which is good for trying to go down and get that water. And it probably lends to why plants that have been applied with a seaweed extract tend to have a higher content of macronutrients in their leaves. And then I would say something that's a common theme with most biostimulants is it has a increased gene expression to detoxify reactive oxygen species or ROS. And really, within a plant cell, these reactive oxygen species cause cellular tissue damage or photooxidation, and is one of the main drivers for heat for an abiotic stress, or the damage that these ROS produce. Now, one of the caveats with these seaweed extracts is they're in the literature, they're kind of called defensive primers. And what academia is alluding to is the effect of drought priming. And what they're calling drought priming or stress memory is an exposure to an earlier stress can then alter the plant's ability to handle a later stress, right? And a good example for that would be an exposure to a drought stress early on, can turn on certain genes that cause the ability to change the root architecture, to go deeper, to go wider, to try and look for water, versus a plant that did not receive that stress. And then later on, when there is a significant drought, those plants that made those decisions early on are better able to handle that stress, and as illustrated by this theoretical figure down on the right. With seaweed extracts and both amino acids, some research has been done on Arabidopsis. And for those who don't have much experience or know about Arabidopsis is basically the plant world's guinea pig, or their lab mice. So most of the introductory work or very new research is first done on Arabidopsis. And what they found was that with seaweed extracts, the plant performed much better when the seaweed extracts were applied a week prior to the stress than it did if it was applied with the stress or following the stress. And the exact opposite can be true, was shown with amino acids. Amino acids tend to work better applied after the stress or slightly after the stress. So they've been kind of deemed as either a defensive primer or as a rescuer. And this is a key thing to understand, because I know our plants don't have access to weather underground or DTN, right? They don't know what's on the horizon, and really we don't either, right? Weather is a hard thing to predict, but we do have an outlook, a 10-day outlook, right? Most weather stations will provide you with a 10-day outlook, and if we can see that on the horizon there is a week of super high temps in the 90s without any moisture in sight, we could say, all right, we're going to go out and apply a seaweed extract product to our crops in the event, in the hopes to help it ride this storm out. Now, changing gears on you guys here one more time, I want to talk about how plant nutrition interacts with drought stress, right? There have been numerous review articles and meta-analysis that illustrate that a drought will decrease the nutrient uptake from the soil. And that's really because there's less nutrients that are being transferred into the soil solution, and precipitation is pretty much required for that. And due to this, foliar fertilization can really be a beneficial and useful tool to growers during these times of drought, as the nutrient is being applied to the foliage and being uptaken and not relying on the roots. But it is a tool that needs to be used strategically. Now, one example of a nutrient that can be used to help mitigate drought is potassium. Potassium is extremely important because it plays a vital role in stomatoregulation with the guard cells. Just overall water to plant relations. It's important for maintaining aquaporins in the cells, which thus controls water movement. Potassium deficiencies have been linked to an increase in ethylene production and a subsequent reduction in ABA activity. And quite frankly, that's sort of the opposite of what we want our crops to experience in the presence of a water stress, right? We want ABA to be working so that we can close those stomates if need to. And really, ethylene is a stress hormone. It's a gaseous stress hormone that lets the world know that I'm stressed and I'm looking for people to be stressed with me. So potassium deficiencies during a drought is definitely not a place where we would want to be. And some research has shown that foliar applications of potassium to water stressed corn those plants were able to increase their tolerance to said water stress and ultimately increase yield over plants that did not receive that foliar fertilization. A couple of other nutrients that are important during drought stress would be manganese and zinc. Manganese plays a critical role in the PSN2 component photosynthesis, where we do split water. And zinc has been shown to be one of the most common micronutrient deficiencies in corn. And really, foliar applications of both manganese and zinc have been reported to help activate genes that can alleviate that photooxidative stress caused by those reactive oxygen species. Now, finally, the last nutrient that I'll talk to you guys about is boron. Boron is super important for many plant functions. It's important for cellular structure, pollen tube development, and pollen tube elongation, and it's vital to the success of pollination. As you can see, there's a massive uptick in boron here on the chart on the left around those late vegetative stages, because they are priming for a successful pollination. Now, since boron is taken up passively through the roots, drought conditions can cause a reduction in overall boron uptake. And that's unfortunate, because I said it's vital for pollination, but it's also been reported that boron is necessary for the translocation of sugars to the grain. And that's why we sort of see a second uptick once these reproductive stages start. So that's why foliar applications have been shown to increase both water status in a plant, but also the photosynthetic rates of crops during reproductive stages. And quite frankly, those are some of the contributing factors as to why growers have now been adding boron to their foliar fungicide applications out of BT to help mitigate some of these potential stresses that can arise. Now, this is the last time that I'll change gears on you guys, but the last thing that I wanted to discuss was how to manage when the season starts to cool down, right? The other side of an abiotic stress. And this will primarily relate to the growers that are growing pastures. But one of the tools that can be utilized to help extend the season once we get into the fall is by utilizing plant growth regulators. And really, with plant growth regulators, there are about 5 main types of plant growth regulators, and they are gibberellins, auxins, and cytokinins, and these are the plant growth promoters. And then there are the acetic acids and ethylene, which I've talked about a few times today, and these are the stress hormones. Now, the one that I'll be focusing on for extending the growing season would be gibberellin. And at Valent Biosciences, we have our own formulation of gibberellin, and we call it Proliant. Now, what Proliant is, it's a 40% formulation of GA3, gibberellic acid. And I would say in production agriculture, there are really 3 main types of gibberellins that are used. We have GA3, and we have GA4 and GA7. Now, GA4 and 7 are primarily have to do with male and female flowers, but it's GA3 that's most notably known for stimulating an increase in biomass through cellular growth and cellular elongation. And what we get with that are taller plants with increased leaf area and ultimately just a more above ground biomass. Now, the reason why this could be a useful tool is because endogenous or plant-made gibberellin is fairly optimal around 75 degrees. But the research or literature has shown that the plant produces a significantly less amount of gibberellic acid once temperatures get to be around 50 degrees. So when temperatures start to fall or when temperatures in the fall start getting colder, growers can utilize a GA3 application to help either extend the grazing period by a few weeks, or they can produce some extra tonnage, right? That can be baled and put away for later. And I think this is pretty well illustrated by the photo on the left, right? The Proliant treated pasture on the left definitely has more biomass than the untreated on the right. I would say the caveat is with this, if we are going to be producing more output, we may need to modify our inputs to accordingly to make sure we're just aligning with the management that we've selected to use. So I'd say with that, I'd like to leave you guys with a few product options that can help mitigate the stresses that we talked about here today. That would be our flagship biostimulant Transit. We also have our Zycron foliar, which is a zinc manganese sulfur biostimulant that is formulated with our Transit, but as well with a seaweed extract. So it can sort of be a multiple 1-2 punch with some added fertility that can help you mitigate those abiotic stresses as they arise throughout our growing season. And lastly, that gibberellin product that we were just talking about with Proliant. I would say if any of you guys on the call are interested in trying these out this year and you want to prove it on your own farm, here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. and we can definitely try it out on our farm. I would say we can utilize our recommendation of products after having a conversation with you and seeing which products of ours will align within your system, or we can have a conversation with your agronomist as well and see what products you guys are wanting to try out. And we'll just compare it to your standard practices or just an untreated control. And really, we would just be looking to monitor how that crop health is performing throughout the year and the final yield results. With that, I'd like to thank you guys for listening for me today. I know if there are any CCAs out here on this call, this talk was approved for 1 hour in crop management, and I will leave the QR code here on the screen that you guys can scan with your app to make sure you guys get your receipts. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll leave this part open here for questions for the next couple minutes if anyone wants to have those. I had one during the call. I'll ask you right now, Drew. It was a good question related to, first of all, disease and how abiotic stress can affect disease progression, especially with the high water early and high temperatures, how that's playing into the disease this year.
Well, I would say definitely wet disease is more prominent with wet and colder soils. So I would say that there's definitely opportunities for disease early on this year with the soil-borne pathogens. And I would say biostimulants can help alleviate some of that stress out the gate. Healthier plants can handle biotic stresses much more than stress plants. And I think Steve actually made a presentation with biostimulants and plant nutrition that can help defend biotic stresses like diseases, as well as insect pressure. So if any of you guys are interested in that presentation as well, I can definitely make sure that we can get that out to you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. And here's another question. What's going to be the effect? We had a lot of rain early on, and even some places still, like in Iowa, but then we get into apparently something called flash droughts later. So how does that affect plant growth when you get a lot of rain in the beginning and then drier conditions later?
Yeah, and I've been talking to a couple of growers about this specifically. A lot of growers out in the Midwest kind of shallowed up their planting because there was adequate moisture and they wanted the crops to get out of the ground. And those crops are really in their infancy right now. I'm sure they're starting to plow through the stages right now, but the root systems really haven't needed, out of necessity, haven't been fully developed. For one, we don't have our nodal roots or our brace roots out right now. And they haven't had the need to go find water or really anchor themselves to go look for water. And my guess is once we get those flash drought conditions, they will be scavenging for water in places where it's the water profile is already below their rooting zone. And we will see floppy corn due to turgor pressures just not being adequate.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. If they didn't build up that root system early, didn't have to actually work for it, then later on when it gets dry, they just won't be able to access that deeper water. Great. Any other questions? Oh, I think I see it. I'm thinking about oh, okay. Someone just making a comment here. Looks like Aaron's typing it out. Cool. Any other questions? Feel free to put it on there. We'll wait another few minutes for those to come in. Glad you guys are able to get your CCA credits. And if you have any other suggestions on topics that we could provide in the future, please let us know. Thank you guys for attending.